contract landed on Scarlet Martinez's trembling hands like a death sentence wrapped in legal jargon. Richard Wellington sat across from her in the sterile conference room, his steel-gray eyes watching her every reaction with the calculated precision of a predator studying wounded prey. 5 years, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. You want me to marry you for 5 years? I want you to survive, Richard corrected, leaning back in his leather chair. At 13-9, he commanded every room he entered with an authority that came from inheriting an empire worth billions. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit tailored to accentuate his imposing frame. Everything about him screamed power, control, dominance. Your flower shop sits on property I need. Your lease expires in 30 days. I can make this easy, or I can make it impossible. Scarlet's green eyes flashed with defiance as she looked up from the contract. At 23, she possessed a natural beauty that needed no enhancement. Blonde hair catching the fluorescent light like spun gold, skin that glowed with the kind of health that came from working with living things rather than corporate spreadsheets. Her hands, stained with soil and flower stems, looked fragile against the pristine white pages. This is insane, she said, standing abruptly. The chair scraped against the polished floor with a harsh screech. You can't just buy people. I'm not buying you. Richard's voice remained maddeningly calm. I'm offering you a partnership. 5 years as my wife, full access to my resources, a trust fund that will set you up for life when it's over. In exchange, you attend social functions, maintain appearances, and stay out of my way. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in. Scarlet could smell his cologne, something expensive and woodsy that probably cost more than she made in a month. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see her little flower shop far below. Petals and dreams looking impossibly small from the 47th floor of Wellington Tower. And if I refuse? Richard stood as well, moving with the fluid. Grace of someone accustomed to always getting what he wanted. He was tall, easily 6'2", and when he stepped closer, Scarlet had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Then you lose everything. The shop, the apartment above it, the life you've built. The construction company that bought your block answers to me. One phone call, and you'll be evicted by Friday. Heat rushed through Scarlet's body, a mixture of rage and something else she didn't want to name. She'd built petals and dreams from nothing, just like her grandmother had taught her. Every arrangement, every satisfied customer, every small success had been earned through sweat and determination. Now this man, this stranger in an expensive suit, thought he could reduce her entire world to a business transaction. You're a monster, she breathed. For just a moment, something flickered in Richard's eyes. Regret? Pain? It was gone so quickly. She might have imagined it. I'm a businessman, he replied. And you have until tomorrow to decide. Charlotte Morgan chose that moment to enter the conference room, her heels clicking against the marble floor with military precision. At 35, Richard's legal advisor was everything Scarlet wasn't. Sharp angles where Scarlet had soft curves, ice blue eyes that had never known warmth, platinum blonde hair pulled back so severely it looked painful. The car's waiting, Charlotte announced, not bothering to acknowledge Scarlet's presence. Your mother called about dinner Sunday. Cancel it, Richard said, without taking his eyes off Scarlet. I may have other obligations. The dismissal was clear. Scarlet gathered what remained of her dignity and headed for the door, but Richard's voice stopped her. Scarlet, she turned, hating herself for the way her pulse quickened at the sound of her name on his lips. Don't make this harder than it has to be. The elevator ride down felt endless. 47 floors of descent, while her world crumbled around her. When she finally stepped onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun felt too bright, the city sounds too loud. Everything seemed surreal, like she was watching someone else's life fall apart. Her flower shop sat nestled between a used bookstore and a small cafe, its cheerful yellow awning a splash of color against the gray concrete. The windows were filled with arrangements she'd made that morning, each one carefully crafted to bring joy to someone's day. Roses and baby's breath for an anniversary, sunflowers and daisies for a child's birthday, orchids for a business opening, Inside, the familiar sense of earth and growing things should have comforted her. Instead, they felt like goodbye kisses from a dying lover. She moved through the shop, touching petals, adjusting stems, trying to memorize every detail.
At night.
Lying in her small apartment above the store, Scarlet stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of her options. She could run, take what little money she had and start over somewhere else. But without references, without connections, how long would it take to rebuild? Years, maybe decades. And she'd be starting from nothing again. Or she could accept Richard Wellington's devil's bargain. 5 years. It seemed like a lifetime and no time at all. What kind of man demanded a marriage contract? What kind of woman would agree to one? Outside her window, the city hummed with life. Cars passed by, their headlights painting moving patterns on her walls. Somewhere out there, Richard Wellington was probably sitting in his penthouse, confident that she would cave to his demands. The thought made her stomach clench with anger and something else, something that felt dangerously like attraction. She'd noticed the way he moved, the careful control he maintained over every gesture, every expression. She'd seen the moment when his mask had slipped, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. It had lasted only seconds, but it was enough to make her wonder what had turned him into the kind of man who solved problems by acquiring people like assets. Dawn was breaking over the city when Scarlet finally made her decision. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, taking extra time with her hair and makeup. If she was going to sell her soul, she would do it looking like the woman she was, not the victim he expected her to be. The receptionist at Wellington Industries looked surprised to see her so early, but made the call upstairs. Within minutes, Scarlet was back in that sterile conference room, facing Richard across the mahogany table. He looked like he hadn't slept. His usually perfect hair slightly mussed, his tie loosened just enough to seem human. "Have you made your decision?" he asked. Scarlet reached for the contract, her hand steady despite the tremor in her chest. She picked up the gold pen he'd left on the table and held it poised over the signature line. "Before I sign this," she said, looking directly into his eyes, "I want you to know something." Richard waited, his expression unreadable. "I may have to marry you," Scarlet continued, "but I will never, ever belong to you." She signed her name with a flourish, the ink dark against the white paper. When she looked up, Richard was staring at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Surprise? Respect? Desire? "We'll see," he said softly, and Scarlet realized with a chill that the real game was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Scarlet stood in the walk-in closet of Richard's penthouse, surrounded by more clothes than she'd owned in her entire life. The garments hung like silent sentinels, each piece chosen by Charlotte with clinical precision. Gowns, tailored suits, shoes that cost more than most people's rent. Everything fit perfectly, everything was beautiful, and everything felt like a costume for a role she never auditioned for. The penthouse itself was a testament to wealth without warmth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the city, but the furniture was all sharp angles and cold surfaces. Modern art hung on the walls, pieces that probably cost millions but conveyed nothing of the man who lived here. It was a space designed to impress, not comfort. "The wedding is tomorrow," Charlotte announced from the bedroom doorway. She held a tablet in her manicured hands, checking items off some invisible list. "Small ceremony, immediate family only. The photographer will arrive at 10, hair and makeup at 8. Scarlet fingered the silk of her wedding dress, a creation of ivory satin and antique lace that had cost more than her flower shop made in 6 months. It was beautiful, perfect, and completely hollow of meaning. "Where's Richard?" she asked. "Business dinner. He'll be back late." Charlotte's tone suggested this was perfectly normal, that husbands regularly abandoned their brides-to-be the night before their wedding. When Charlotte left, Scarlet found herself wandering the empty penthouse like a ghost. The kitchen was a chef's dream, all gleaming steel and expensive appliances that looked unused. The living room could have housed her entire flower shop. Even the guest bathrooms were larger than her old bedroom. She ended up on the terrace, the city sprawling, below her in a glittering tapestry of lights, The wind whipped her hair around her face, carrying the sense of exhaust and distant rain. Up here, she felt disconnected from everything real, floating in a bubble of wealth and isolation. Can't sleep? Scarlet spun around to find Richard standing in the doorway. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, the first time she'd seen him looking anything less than perfectly composed. His hair was disheveled from the wind, and there was something different in his expression, weariness that made him look younger and more human. "I was thinking about my grandmother," she said, turning back to the view. "She would have hated this." Richard moved to stand beside her at the railing, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of whiskey.
"Tell
me about her." The request surprised her. In the 3 weeks since she'd signed the contract, their interactions had been purely functional. Meetings with the wedding planner, fittings for clothes, discussions about schedules and expectations. He'd never asked her anything personal. "She started the flower shop with nothing," Scarlet said. "Came to this country when she was 19, barely spoke English, but she understood flowers. She said they were the universal language, that they could say what words couldn't." "What would she say about this?" Richard asked, gesturing between them. Scarlet considered the question. She'd say, "I was trading my freedom for security, and that was the oldest transaction in the world." "And what would you say?" The question hung in the air between them. Scarlet studied Richard's profile in the moonlight, noting the strong line of his jaw, the way shadows gathered in the hollow of his throat. There was something almost vulnerable about him in this moment, something that made her want to reach out and touch. "I'd say I don't know who I am anymore," she admitted. Richard turned to face her fully, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might say something real, something that would crack the careful facade they'd both been maintaining. Instead, he stepped back. "You should get some sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day." The wedding was everything Scarlet had never wanted. Small, yes, but each detail was orchestrated with military precision. Richard's mother, Margaret Wellington, was a silver-haired society matron who looked at Scarlet like she was something distasteful stuck to her shoe. His father had died young, leaving behind only photographs and the weight of expectation that pressed down on Richard's shoulders like a physical thing. Scarlet's own family was represented by her Aunt Rosa, who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 8. Rosa's eyes were red with unshed tears throughout the ceremony, and Scarlet knew it wasn't from joy. The officiant spoke about love and commitment, words that felt hollow in the sterile hotel ballroom. When it came time for vows, Richard and Scarlet had agreed to use traditional ones, generic promises that meant nothing and everything at the same time. "Do you, Richard James Wellington, take Scarlet Maria Martinez to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was steady, professional, the same tone he probably used in board meetings. "Do you, Scarlet Maria Martinez, take Richard James Wellington to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Scarlet's throat felt dry as sand. She could feel the weight of everyone's attention, the cameras documenting this farce for posterity. "I do." When Richard kissed her, it was supposed to be for show. A brief, perfunctory pressing of lips to seal their business arrangement. Instead, his mouth was warm and firm against hers, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with surprising gentleness. For a moment that lasted both forever and no time at all, Scarlet felt something electric pass between them, a spark of genuine connection that left her breathless. The reception was a blur of congratulations from people she didn't know, small. Talk about the romantic whirlwind courtship, and champagne that tasted like expensive disappointment. Through it all, Richard stayed by her side, playing the devoted groom with an Oscar-worthy performance. But Scarlet caught the moments when his mask slipped, the way his jaw tightened, when his mother made pointed comments about appropriate matches. The flash of something that might have been pain when Charlotte whispered updates about business calls he was missing. The careful distance he maintained even while touching her, as if he was afraid to get too close. Later that night, back in the penthouse, they faced each other across the living room like strangers who had accidentally ended up in the same elevator. "The spare bedroom is prepared for you," Richard said, his voice carefully neutral. "Have complete privacy." Scarlet felt a stab of something that might have been disappointment. Of course. This arrangement doesn't require. He seemed to struggle with the words. Physical intimacy isn't part of our contract. He'd flooded Scarlet's cheeks. She hadn't expected it to be, but hearing him say it so clinically made her feel like a business. Acquisition rather than a woman, I understand. Richard moved toward the hallway, then stopped. Scarlet. She looked up, hope fluttering in her chest like a caged bird. Thank you, he said. For today. It's for all of this. After he disappeared into his bedroom, Scarlet stood alone in the vast living room, still wearing her wedding dress, feeling more isolated than she ever had in her small apartment above the flower shop. Through the windows, the city glittered, with promise and possibility, but up here in her gilded cage, she felt like the last person on earth. She was married to a man who looked at her like she was a problem to be solved rather than a woman to be loved. She was trapped in a life of luxury that felt more like prison than paradise. Somewhere in the space between his careful control and her wounded pride, something dangerous was beginning to grow. Something that felt suspiciously like desire. The wedding ring on her finger caught the city lights, throwing tiny rainbows across the marble floor. It was beautiful and expensive and completely meaningless, just like everything else in her new life. But when she touched her lips, she could still feel the warmth of Richard's kiss. She wondered if some cages were more dangerous than others. 2 months into their marriage, Scarlet discovered Richard's secret at 3 a.m. She'd been unable to sleep, haunted by dreams of wilting flowers and empty promises, when she heard music drifting through the penthouse. Not the sterile, classical compositions that usually played during Charlotte's approved social gatherings, but something raw and haunting, piano notes that seemed to bleed emotion into the cold air. Following the sound, Scarlet found herself standing outside, a door she'd never seen opened. Through the crack, she glimpsed Richard at a grand piano, his fingers moving across the keys with the kind of passion she'd never seen him display in their carefully orchestrated public appearances. His shirt was unbuttoned, his hair falling across his forehead as he bent over the instrument. The melody he played was heartbreaking, full of longing and loss, each note a confession he'd never spoken aloud. In the soft light of the music room, he looked nothing like the cold businessman who had blackmailed her into marriage. He looked like a man carrying wounds that had never properly healed. Scarlet must have made some sound, because Richard's hands stilled on the keys. He looked up, catching her watching him, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry," Scarlet whispered. "I heard the music and ... It's fine." Richard's voice was rougher than usual, stripped of its usual professional polish. He closed the piano lid with careful precision, the click echoing in the sudden quiet. "I didn't mean to wake you. I couldn't sleep." She stepped into the room uninvited, drawn by something she couldn't name. It was beautiful. "What was it?" Richard stood, moving away from the piano as if it had burned him. "Nothing important." But Scarlet could see the lie in the tension of his shoulders, the way he avoided her eyes. "You wrote it, didn't you?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Richard's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might deny it instead. He walked to the windows, staring out at the sleeping city. "My father wanted me to be a concert pianist," he said finally, "before he died, before I inherited all of this. I was supposed to go to Juilliard, study in Vienna, live for music instead." Of quarterly reports, Scarlet moved closer, drawn by the pain in his voice. What happened? Reality happened. The company needed an heir, not an artist. The board needed stability, not someone who thought in melodies instead of margins. He turned to face her, and she saw something broken in his gray eyes, so I learned to speak their language instead. "But you still play. Sometimes." When the silence becomes too loud, the confession created an intimacy between them that felt more dangerous than any physical touch. Scarlet found herself studying this version of Richard, the one who created beauty in the dark hours when no one was watching. It was the first glimpse she'd had of the man he might have been, before duty and expectation had carved him into something harder. "Play something else," she said impulsively. Richard shook his head. "It's late. You should go back to bed." "I don't want to go back to bed. I want to hear you play." The challenge in her voice seemed to surprise him. For weeks they'd moved around each other like polite strangers, maintaining the careful distance their arrangement required. But here, in this room, filled with music and moonlight, the pretense felt impossible to maintain. Richard returned to the piano bench, his movements hesitant. When his fingers found the keys again, the melody that emerged was different from the first, softer and more tentative, like a question being asked in a language only the heart understood. Scarlet sat in a nearby chair, letting the music wash over her. She watched Richard's face as he played, saw the way his features softened, the careful control slipping away to reveal something raw and real underneath. This was who he was when he thought no one was looking, when the weight of expectation lifted just enough to let him breathe. When the last note faded, silence settled between them again, but it felt different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. "Why did you really choose me?" Scarlet asked. The question had been burning in her chest for months, but she'd never dared voice it. Out of all the women in the city, why me? Richard's hand stilled on the keys. "I told you it was convenient. That's not the truth." She leaned forward, studying his profile in the dim light. "There's something else, something you haven't told me." For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, so quietly, she almost missed it, he said, "You reminded me of someone I used to be." The words hit her like a physical blow. She saw it then, the reason behind his careful cruelty, the desperate need to control everything and everyone around him. He wasn't just acquiring assets. He was trying to reclaim something he'd lost, something that had died with his dreams of concert halls and standing ovations. "Richard." She stood, taking a step toward him, but he rose abruptly from the piano bench. This was a mistake. His voice was back to its professional timbre, the walls slamming back into place. "We should maintain appropriate boundaries." Appropriate boundaries. The words came out harsher than she intended. "We're married. We live in the same house. How much more appropriate can we get?" "This is a business arrangement, Scarlet, nothing more." The dismissal stung, but it also ignited something fierce in her chest. For 2 months, she'd played the compliant wife, attended his social functions, smiled for photographers, pretended to be happy with a life that felt like slow suffocation. But watching him retreat behind his walls again, seeing him deny the connection that had hummed between them moments before, made her realize she was tired of being treated like a beautiful ornament. "Fine," she said, her voice deadly calm. "Then let me conduct some business of my own." Richard frowned. "What do you mean?" "I want to reopen my flower shop." The words fell between them like a gauntlet. Richard's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like panic. "That's not possible. The building is scheduled for demolition. Then I'll find another location. I have access to your resources now, remember, part of our mutually beneficial arrangement." She could see him calculating, trying to find a way to refuse without revealing too much of his hand. The flower shop represented everything he'd tried to take from her. The independence and passion he'd needed to eliminate to make their arrangement work. "It's not practical," he said finally. "You have obligations now, social commitments, appearances to maintain. I can do both." Scarlet moved closer, close enough to see the way his pupils dilated when she invaded his personal space.
Less.
"You're afraid I might remember who I was before you tried to turn me into someone else." The challenge hung in the air between them, electric with tension and unspoken truths. Richard's carefully constructed world was beginning to crack, and they both knew it. "Do whatever you want," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Just don't expect me to help you." As he walked past her toward the door, Scarlet caught his arm. The contact sent electricity shooting through her fingertips, and she saw Richard feel it too in the way his body went rigid. I don't need your help," she said softly. "I never did." But as Richard pulled away and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway, Scarlet realized that wasn't entirely true. She didn't need his help to rebuild her business or reclaim her independence. She needed it to understand the broken, beautiful man who played heartbreak on piano keys at 3 a.m, who had traded his dreams for duty and convinced himself it was enough. And as she stood alone in the music room, surrounded by the ghost of melodies and the lingering scent of his cologne, she realized something that terrified her more than any contract or ultimatum. She was falling in love with her captor, one haunting note at a time. The grand reopening of Petals and Dreams took place on a crisp October morning in a space 3 times larger than her original shop. Scarlet had found the location herself, negotiated the lease with money from the trust fund Richard had established, and spent 6 weeks transforming the empty storefront into something magical. She hadn't invited Richard, but he came anyway. Scarlet was arranging a display of autumn flowers when she felt eyes on her. She looked up to find him standing in the doorway, looking impossibly out of place in his tailored black suit among the riot of colors and natural textures she'd created. Customers flowed around him like water around a stone, but his attention was focused entirely on her. "It's beautiful," he said when she approached him, his voice carrying an odd note she couldn't identify. "Thank you." She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly self-conscious. They'd barely spoken since the night in the music room. Maintaining their careful distance, even while sharing the same space, "I wasn't sure you'd come. I had to see what all the fuss was about." His gray eyes swept the shop, taking in every detail. "Charlotte mentioned you've been getting significant media attention. People are curious about the Wellington heiress who wants to get her hands dirty." Scarlet gestured to her soil-stained apron, practical clothes she wore like armor against the designer wardrobe waiting at home. "It's not exactly the image they expected." Something flickered across Richard's face. Pride? Regret? She could decipher it. Charlotte appeared at his elbow, her expression tight with barely concealed irritation. "Richard, we need to go. The board meeting was moved up an hour. Give me a minute." Charlotte's lips pressed into a thin line, but she stepped away, positioning herself near the door like a guard dog waiting for threats. "She doesn't approve," Scarlet observed. "Charlotte doesn't approve of anything that can't be quantified in a quarterly report." Richard moved deeper into the shop, his fingers trailing along the edge of a display case filled with delicate orchids. "This place feels like you." The comment was so unexpected, so unlike his usual careful neutrality, that Scarlet felt her breath catch. "What do you mean, alive?" he said simply. "Everything here is alive." Before she could respond, a commotion near the front of the shop drew their attention. A young woman was arguing with Charlotte, her voice rising with frustration. "I just want to interview Mrs. Wellington about her business. It's a human interest piece." "Mrs. Wellington is not available for interviews," Charlotte replied with icy precision. "All media requests must go through our public relations department." Scarlet felt Richard tense beside her, but she was already moving toward the confrontation. "It's fine, Charlotte. I can speak for myself." Scarlet Richard's voice carried a warning, but she ignored it. "Rebecca Torres from the City Tribune," the young reporter said, pulling out a recorder. I'd love to ask you a few questions about your decision to reopen your business despite your husband's initial opposition to it." The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Scarlet felt the entire shop go quiet, customers and staff turning to watch the drama unfold. Charlotte looked like she might physically remove the reporter while Richard had gone, completely still beside her. "My husband has always been supportive of my entrepreneurial endeavors," Scarlet said carefully. "But according to our sources, Wellington Industries was the development company that forced you to close your original location." Rebecca's eyes gleamed with the scent of a story. "Isn't it true that you only married Richard Wellington after he threatened to destroy your business?" The silence that followed was deafening. Scarlet could feel Richard's tension radiating off him in waves. Could see Charlotte calculating damage control strategies. Everyone in the shop was watching, waiting to see how she would respond to having her deepest shame aired in public. Instead of denial or deflection, Scarlet felt something unexpected rise in her chest. Anger, yes, but also a fierce kind of liberation. She was tired of pretending, tired of smiling for cameras while her soul withered behind the facade. "You want the truth?" she said, her voice carrying clearly through the shop. "My husband didn't threaten to destroy my business. He did destroy it. And then he offered me a choice that wasn't really a choice at all." Scarlet, Richard's voice, was low, dangerous. She turned to face him, seeing the careful mask slip to reveal something raw and desperate underneath. What, isn't this what you wanted? Complete control over my life, my choices, my voice? That's not what this was about. Then what was it about, Richard? The words came out louder than she intended, but she couldn't stop now. Because for months I've been trying to understand why you needed to own me instead of just asking me out for coffee, like a normal person. The reporter was scribbling frantically, but Scarlet had forgotten about her. Forgotten about the audience, forgotten about everything, except the man standing in front of her with pain written across his features like a roadmap of regret. You. Want to know why? Richard's control finally snapped, his voice rising to match hers. Because I'm not a normal person. I'm someone who destroys everything good he touches, who turns dreams into spreadsheets and beauty into profit margins. And you were so alive, so genuine, that I couldn't stand it. The admission hit the shop like a shockwave. Scarlet felt her anger drain away, replaced by something that felt dangerously like understanding. So you decided to destroy me too? I decided to save you from someone better. His voice broke on the last word. Someone who wouldn't reduce your passion to a business transaction. The raw honesty in his confession left Scarlet speechless. Around them, the shop had gone silent. Customers and staff frozen by the intensity of the moment. Even Rebecca had stopped writing, her recorder capturing words that cut deeper than any expose. Charlotte chose that moment to intervene, stepping between them with practiced efficiency. That's quite enough. Richard, the car is waiting. But Richard didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Scarlet's face, searching for something she wasn't sure she could give him. I never meant for it to go this far, he said quietly. I thought I could keep it simple, clean, but nothing about you has ever been simple. Scarlet felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of everyone, not when she was finally seeing the truth of what lay between them. You're right, she said. I'm not simple, not easy to control, or manipulate or reduce to a contract clause. If that makes me inconvenient for your carefully ordered life, then maybe it's time we renegotiated our terms. Richard's expression shifted, surprise replacing some of the pain. What are you saying? I'm saying our business arrangement is over? Scarlet pulled off her wedding ring, the diamond catching the afternoon light as she held it out to him. Find yourself another asset to acquire, Mr. Wellington. This one just quit. The ring dropped into his palm like a stone into still water, the sound of it hitting his skin echoing through the sudden silence. Richard stared down at it for a long moment, then looked back up at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Scarlet, wait. But she was already turning away, moving toward the back of the shop, where she could breathe, where she could think, where she could figure out what came next, now that she'd just blown up her entire life in front of half the city. Behind her, she heard Charlotte's sharp voice cutting through the stunned silence, assuring Richard to ward the door with military efficiency. The reporter was asking questions that no one answered. Customers were beginning to murmur among themselves, processing what they'd just witnessed. But all Scarlet could focus on was the feeling of the ring's absence on her finger. The weight of freedom settling on her shoulders like a cloak she'd forgotten how to wear. She just walked away from security, from luxury, from the safety net that had kept her afloat for the past 4 months. She'd probably just created a scandal that would follow her for years. Destroyed any chance of rebuilding her reputation in the city's close-knit business community, and for the first time since signing Richard's contract, she felt like she could breathe. 3 days after the disaster at her flower shop, Scarlet found Richard waiting for her in the rain. She'd been staying at her Aunt Rosa's house, sleeping on the same pull-out couch she'd used as a teenager. Trying to piece together what remained of her life, the media attention had been brutal. Her public confrontation with Richard had been captured on phone cameras and shared across social media, turning their private pain into public entertainment. Richard stood on Rosa's front porch like a man who'd lost everything, his usually perfect hair plastered to his head by the October downpour. His expensive suit soaked through. He looked nothing like the controlled businessman who had blackmailed her into marriage. He looked broken. How long have you been standing here? Scarlet asked through the screen door. Since dawn. His voice was hoarse, barely audible above, The rain drumming on the roof. Rosa wouldn't let me in. That smart woman. Scarlet, please, I need to talk to you. She studied his face through the mesh screen, noting the shadows under his eyes. The stubble that suggested he hadn't slept or shaved in days. Part of her wanted to leave him standing there, let him experience a fraction of the powerlessness she'd felt for months. But the larger part, the part that had fallen in love with the man who played piano at 3 in the morning, couldn't bear. To see him suffer, she stepped onto the porch, staying close to the door in case she needed to retreat. You have 5 minutes. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick folder, the paper warped by rainwater. I had Charlotte draw up dissolution papers. Everything's in there. The trust fund, the property settlements, even a new lease for your flower shop location. All you have to do is sign. Scarlet stared at the folder, shocked. You're just giving me everything. It was always yours. The contract, the marriage, all of it was just my cowardly way of keeping you close without having to risk being rejected. He ran a hand through his wet hair, leaving it sticking up at odd angles. I convinced myself I was protecting you from the development project, but the truth is I was protecting myself from having to be vulnerable. Rain continued to fall around them, creating a curtain that isolated them from the rest of the world. Scarlet could hear Rosa moving around inside the house, probably listening to every word despite her promises to give them privacy. Why now? She asked. Why are you willing to let me go? Richard's laugh was bitter, self-deprecating. Because 3 days ago, you looked at me like I was everything you despised about the world. And you were right, Richard. No, let me finish. He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the pain etched in every line of his face. I spent so many years building walls, protecting myself from feeling anything real, that I forgot how to be human. Then you walked into my life with your passion and your authenticity, and I panicked. Instead of trying to earn your affection, I just took it, like everything else in my life. The confession hung between them, raw and honest in a way their entire relationship had never been. Scarlet felt her carefully constructed anger beginning to crack, revealing the love she'd tried so hard to bury beneath it. I fired Charlotte, Richard continued. Dissolved the development project. The entire block where your original shop stood is being converted into a community garden. I thought you should know. You did what? It's what you would have wanted. What should have happened from the beginning if I hadn't been so terrified of asking for something I might not get. Scarlet stared at him, processing the magnitude of what he'd just told her. Charlotte had been his closest advisor for years, the development project worth millions to his company. He'd given up everything that had seemed to matter to him. The board must be furious. The board voted me out yesterday. Richard's smile was rueful, but somehow lighter than she'd ever seen it. Turns out destroying profitable ventures and firing key personnel in fits of conscience isn't considered sound business practice. So you've lost everything. No. He shook his head, water droplets flying from his hair. I lost everything months ago when I chose control over connection, when I decided to own you instead of love you. Yesterday, I just made it official. The word love hit Scarlet like lightning, illuminating everything she'd been trying to ignore. The way he'd watched her in the flower shop, the vulnerability in his music, the pain in his eyes when she'd handed back his ring. It had all been there, hidden beneath layers of fear and self-protection. You never said, she whispered. I never thought I had the right. Richard took another step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body despite the cold rain. I blackmailed you into marriage, Scarlet. I destroyed your business and used your desperation against you. What kind of man tells a woman he loves her after that? It's the kind of man who's willing to give up everything to make it right. The words surprised her even as she spoke them. But looking at Richard now, seeing the way he'd stripped away every defense, every carefully constructed wall, she realized that this was what she'd been waiting for. Not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but honesty. The willingness to be vulnerable, to risk rejection for the chance at something real. I love you too, she said, the admission flowing out of her like water through a broken dam. I fought it, hated myself for it, but I fell in love with the man who played heartbreak on piano keys and looked at me like I was the only real thing in his artificial world. Richard's eyes widened, hope and disbelief warring in their gray depths. Even after everything I did? Because of everything you did? Scarlet reached for him, her hands finding the lapels of his soaked jacket. You made terrible choices, Richard. You hurt me, manipulated me, tried to turn me into something I wasn't. But you also showed me parts of yourself that no one else had ever seen. And when I demanded better, you became better. I want to deserve you, he said, his voice breaking. I want to be the man who asks you to dance instead of demanding your presence, who brings you flowers instead of trying to own the garden. Scarlet laughed, surprising them both. You want to bring me flowers? I own a flower shop. Then I'll bring you music. I'll write you songs that say everything I was too afraid to speak out loud. The promise was so perfectly Richard, so beautifully him, that Scarlet felt the last of her defenses crumble. She pulled him closer, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. This kiss was nothing like their wedding kiss, nothing like the careful performance they'd maintained for months. This was desperate and hungry and real, tasting of rain and regret and the promise of something better. Richard's arms came around her, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world, like he couldn't believe she was choosing him despite everything. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Scarlet kept her hands on his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palms. So what happens now? She asked. Now we figure it out together? Richard brushed a strand of wet hair from her face, his touch gentle in a way that would have been impossible months ago. No contracts, no ultimatums, no predetermined outcomes. Just two people choosing each other every day. It sounds terrifying. It sounds perfect. Rosa chose that moment to open the front door, her face a mixture of exasperation and fondness. Are you two planning to stand out here in the rain all day? Because I made coffee, and frankly, you both look like you could use some warming up. Scarlet looked at Richard, seeing her own future reflected in his eyes. It wouldn't be easy. They had damage to repair, trust to rebuild, a relationship to construct from the ground up. Wait! Like they had something worth fighting for. Coffee sounds perfect, she said, taking his hand. As they stepped into the warmth of Rosa's kitchen, leaving puddles on the linoleum floor. Scarlet realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with the worst possible choices. Sometimes you had to lose everything to discover what really mattered. Sometimes, if you were very lucky, the person who broke you was also the person willing to spend their life putting you back together. 6 months later, Richard played piano at their real wedding. The one with handwritten vows and flowers from Scarlet's garden and promises that meant everything because they chose to make them freely. And he looked up at her from the piano bench, his fingers dancing across the keys in a melody he'd written just for her. Scarlet saw the future in his eyes. It was beautiful, imperfect, and entirely theirs. The end deal. Like this video if the story touched your heart. Subscribe for more emotional tales and share with someone who believes in the power of true love. And let us know in the comments. We love connecting with our global community of romance lovers.